They laughed when I joined their charity auction. They stopped laughing when I outbid them on everything. The auction was in full swing before the first gavel even fell. Not the auction of art and antiques, but the silent, relentless auction of status. I watched it from my seat at table 14, a small, forgotten island in a sea of black ties and silk dresses. My table was tucked in the back, near the service entrance, a location so deliberately insignificant it was almost an insult. Across the grand ballroom of the museum, I could see my daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Richard. They were the hosts, the radiant center of this glittering universe, moving from one cluster of important people to another, their laughter as bright and polished as the crystal chandeliers above. They had not looked in my direction once since I arrived. Eleanor had invited me, of course. Her voice on the phone last week had been a symphony of loving condescension. "Mom, you should come to the gala. It's for a wonderful cause," she'd said. "Just come for the experience, for the champagne. Don't worry about the auction itself. Everything is terribly expensive." Her words were meant to sound like she was protecting me, but I knew what she was really saying. "You don't belong in our world, but we will permit you to observe it from a safe distance." I was to be a quaint, harmless accessory to their evening of social climbing. My late husband, Arthur, would have despised this. Not the art, never the art, but the performance. He was a history professor with one great, consuming passion: collecting. But he never collected for status. He taught me that an object's true value has nothing to do with its price tag. It's in the story it holds the hands that made it the quiet history it has witnessed. Our weekends were spent in dusty antique shops and small-town auctions, not here in this room, humming with the sound of wealth. He taught me how to see, really see. A lesson I feared my own daughter had never learned. It's a strange thing to feel like a stranger in your own family's world, isn't it? As I share this story with you tonight, I find myself wondering where you are listening. It would bring me a quiet joy to know where my voice has found a home. If you'd take a moment to leave a comment and perhaps subscribe to Granny's Stories, it would mean the world to know we're all in this together. The lights in the ballroom began to dim. The conversations quieted. My son-in-law Richard was stepping up to the podium looking handsome and confident in his tuxedo. The show was about to begin. He gave a charming speech, and then the professional auctioneer took over. The first item was a week-long stay in a private villa in Tuscany. Richard, as the co-chair, made a bold opening bid of $20,000 a performance for the crowd. A man I recognized as a local real estate tycoon countered with 25. They went back and forth, the numbers climbing, until Richard, with a theatrical sigh of defeat, faltered at $40,000. The auctioneer began his final call, his voice a smooth, practiced chant. $40,000 going once. 40,000 going twice. He paused, his eyes scanning the room for any last-minute contenders. And from the back of the room, from the quiet invisible table by the service entrance, a voice calm, clear, and unfamiliar to most. In that room, my voice cut through the silence. 50,000, I said. A hush fell. Not a gradual quieting, but a sudden, sharp intake of collective breath. Every head, including the perfectly coiffed one of my own daughter, turned to look at the forgotten old woman in the simple black dress. And in that moment, under the shocked and bewildered stares of 100 strangers, I knew the evening had just become a great deal more interesting. The auctioneer, a man with a voice as smooth as polished silver, hesitated for only a second. His eyes found me in the back of the room, a small, still figure in a sea of shocked faces. "I have a bid of $50,000 from the lady at table 14. He announced a note of surprise in his own voice. He looked back at Richard, at the real estate tycoon, giving them a chance to counter. But they were both too stunned to speak. Richard was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, while the other man simply shook his head with a small, amused smile. Going once, going twice. Sold the gavel fell with a sharp, definitive crack to the lady in the back. A polite, bewildered ripple of applause spread through the room. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the auctioneer. Then I turned my gaze to my daughter. Across the ballroom, Eleanor's face was a mask of pale, frozen horror. Richard looked like he had been struck. I gave them both that same tiny nod, a quiet acknowledgement, as if we had planned this all along. The murmur in the room slowly died down, and the auction continued. The next item was a large, abstract painting, a chaotic splash of blues and golds that I knew Richard had wanted for the lobby of his new corporate office. He had spoken of it for weeks. It was a statement piece, he'd said. He started the bidding, his voice a little less confident than before. The price climbed. I let him fight for it. I let him get that look of victory in his eyes as the bidding slowed. Then, just as the auctioneer's gavel was about to fall, I raised my paddle. 60,000, I said, my voice carrying easily in the quiet room. Richard's head snapped in my direction. He was out. The painting was mine. Then came the sapphire necklace, a delicate, glittering thing that I knew Eleanor had coveted. She had shown me the picture in the auction catalog, her finger tracing its outline. "Isn't it divine, Mom?" she had sighed. She bid on it, her hand trembling slightly as she raised her paddle. She was up against a woman in a red dress with far too much jewelry. Eleanor bravely pushed the price higher than I knew she could afford. Then she, too, faltered. And once again, from the back of the room, my voice cut through the tension. 75,000. The necklace was mine. They announced a short intermission for champagne. It was the moment I had been waiting for. I saw them making their way toward me, a storm front of anger and confusion moving through the otherwise calm, glittering sea of people. They descended upon my small table, their faces tight with fury. "What do you think you're doing, Mother Eleanor?" hissed her voice, a low, sharp whisper. Richard stood behind her, his arms crossed, looking down at me as if I were a misbehaving child. "Where did you get this kind of money? Are you trying to embarrass us?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I looked from my daughter's furious face to my son-in-law's bewildered one. "Eleanor, dear," I said, my voice calm and sweet. "You told me to come and have some fun. I'm having a wonderful time." "This isn't fun, Mom. This is a performance." Everyone is staring, asking questions. "And what about the money?" Richard added, "That's Arthur's pension. You can't just throw it away on jewelry and paintings." I finally allowed myself a small smile. "My dear Richard, I said you always assumed Arthur's only asset was his mind. You were wrong. He was a much more successful collector than either of you ever realized." They stood there speechless, their faces a mixture of anger and utter incomprehension. The auctioneer's voice called everyone back to their seats. As my daughter opened her mouth to say something else to lecture me further, I simply raised my bidding paddle high in the air. I didn't even wait for the auctioneer to announce the next item. I looked directly at Eleanor and Richard and said loud enough for our entire corner of the room to hear $100,000. For whatever is next. They stared at me completely and utterly defeated. The auction was only half over, but their evening I knew was ruined, and mine was just getting started. The auctioneer, to his credit, recovered quickly. He announced that my preemptive bid of $100,000 was for the final premier item of the evening, the naming sponsorship of the museum's new children's art education program. A wave of appreciative applause, much warmer this time, filled the room. The gavel fell without another bid being placed. The program was mine. I was invited to the stage. I saw Eleanor's hand fly to her mouth, a gesture of pure, unadulterated shock. I walked to the stage slowly, my legs steady. I did not look at my daughter or my son-in-law. I looked out at the sea of expectant faces. I took the microphone, and my voice did not tremble. I spoke briefly about my late husband's belief that art was not a luxury for the few, but a necessary language for everyone, especially children. And then I delivered my final quiet blow. I am therefore delighted, I said, my eyes finding Eleanor in the crowd, to make this donation in the name of the next generation of my family, in honor of my beloved granddaughter Sophie. I did not return to my table in the back. The dynamics of the room had shifted. People came to me now. The real estate tycoon who Richard had been so desperate to impress came over to shake my hand. The woman in the red dress who had bid against Eleanor for the necklace introduced herself and complimented my discerning eye. I was no longer the quaint, forgotten mother-in-law. I had become a mysterious benefactor, a woman of substance and hidden depths. I spoke with them all politely, calmly, all the while watching my daughter and her husband across the room. They were isolated now, standing alone in the glittering world they had worked so hard to conquer. They had become the ghosts at my feast. When the evening ended, I settled my account with a quiet word to the event's financial manager, arranging a direct transfer from a private investment account that I knew Richard had no idea existed. The ride home in their large, silent car was the most excruciatingly quiet 15 minutes of my life. The air was thick with their anger, their humiliation, their unspoken questions. But they asked none of them. They had lost the right to. I, the woman who was told not to worry her pretty little head about bidding, had become the evening's biggest spender. The power had shifted so completely, so irrevocably, that it had rendered them mute. They dropped me off at my small, quiet house, the one they thought held nothing but a lonely old woman and a collection of dusty, worthless memories. Richard offered a stiff, formal good night. Eleanor said nothing at all. There was nothing left to say. I walked up my own front path, unlocked my own door, and stepped inside. The silence of my own home welcomed me like an old friend. On my wall hung the first painting Arthur and I ever bought, a small, unsigned landscape of a stormy sea that had cost us $20 at a flea market. It was more valuable to me than everything I had purchased tonight. They thought the evening had been about money, about showing off. They were wrong. It had been about a lesson, a quiet lesson in value. And I, the forgotten woman from table 14, had been the one teaching it. The morning after the auction, my small house felt quieter than usual. but it was a comfortable, solid silence. The sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the spines of my husband's old books. The items I had won the painting, the necklace, the trip, were simply line items on a receipt for now abstractions. The real victory was here in this room, surrounded by the things Arthur and I had chosen together, things bought for love, not for show. I made my tea and sat in the worn armchair by the window, feeling the profound, quiet exhaustion that follows a battle well fought. I had not slept well, not from regret, but from the sheer vibrating energy of the night before. I had spent a lifetime being polite, agreeable, a soft background presence. I had forgotten the formidable woman I could be when pushed. The auction had not created her. It had simply reawakened her. The phone rang just after 10. It was Eleanor. Her voice was not the furious hiss from the night before, but something thinner, more fragile, laced with a bewildered hurt. She asked the question I knew was coming. Why, Mom? Why would you humiliate us like that in front of everyone? I did not answer her question with an accusation. I answered it with a truth. I wasn't trying to humiliate you, Eleanor. I said, my voice calm. I was refusing to be humiliated myself. You and Richard invited me to your evening, but you seated me at a table of one and asked me to remain invisible. You made the entire event about status and appearances. I was simply participating in the game you invited me to play. I'm only sorry you were surprised to find out I knew the rules. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. But the money, she finally whispered. Where did it come from? It came from your father, I said gently. It came from a lifetime of his quiet, intelligent choices, from pieces of art and history he bought for a song, and which you both dismissed as Dad's old junk. The value was always there, Eleanor. You just never learned how to see it. She had no response to that. We ended the call a few moments later, not with a resolution, but with a new, clear understanding. The old relationship, the one where I was the quiet, dependent mother, and she was the successful, slightly embarrassed daughter, was over. After I hung up, I felt a sense of finality. The conflict was done. Now I had to decide what to do with the spoils of my quiet war. The painting I had won, the one Richard had coveted for his office, would be delivered next week. I made a second phone call, this one to the director of the local public library, and I donated it to them on the condition that it be hung where everyone, especially the children, could see it. The sapphire necklace I would place in a bank vault, a gift for my granddaughter Sophie, for a day when she was old enough to understand its value, not just its price. And the trip to Tuscany, that was for me, but not for me alone. I looked at the photograph of Sophie on my mantelpiece. It was time to build a new bridge. The phone call with Eleanor had been a necessary ending. But this call, the one I was making now to my granddaughter, felt like a new beginning. I had bought a trip to Tuscany to prove a point to my daughter. Now I was going to use it to build a connection with her child. The auction was over. The bidding was done. It was time to stop collecting objects and start collecting memories. My own memories this time. The phone call to my granddaughter Sophie was like opening a window in a stuffy room. I told her about the trip to Tuscany, and her reaction was not the calculated surprise of her parents, but a pure, unadulterated gasp of joy. For me, Grandma? She asked, her voice a squeak of disbelief. Really, just us. Her delight was so genuine, so untainted by status or social maneuvering, that it washed away the last of the bitter aftertaste from the auction. I explained that it was time the women in our family saw a bit of the world and that I couldn't think of a better traveling companion. Her excitement was a balm to my soul. Of course, my daughter did not see it that way. Eleanor called me 2 days later, her voice a tightrope of feigned nonchalance. "Sophie told me about your trip." She said the word trip, sounding like an accusation. I could hear the unspoken question hanging in the air between us. Why her and not me? I did not offer a long explanation. I did not apologize. I simply said, yes. I thought it was time I shared your father's love of art with someone who would appreciate it as a gift, not as a social opportunity. The line went quiet. She did not have a response to that because it was the truth. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I was no longer seeking her approval, and its absence had left her without a script. The weeks leading up to the trip were filled with a new kind of happy planning. Sophie would come to my house after school, and we would spread maps and guidebooks across the old oak dining table. Unlike her parents, she was interested in the details in the history. Her eyes, so much like Arthur's, would light up as I told her stories of the Renaissance painters of the Medici family. She wanted to see everything, not to take pictures for social media, but out of a deep and genuine curiosity. We planned our days around museums and quiet gardens, not expensive restaurants or designer shops. We were not planning a performance. We were planning an adventure. One afternoon, as we were looking at pictures of the Uffizi gallery online, Eleanor came to pick Sophie up. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching us, her face a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. She looked at the maps on the table, at her daughter's happy, animated face, at me. "Dad always wanted to see Botticelli's Venus," she said, her voice quiet, almost wistful. It was the first time she had mentioned her father in a nostalgic way in years. I did not offer her an invitation to join us. That bridge had been burned, and it was too soon to rebuild. But I offered her a small, fragile peace offering of my own. "I know," I said gently. "I'll be sure to tell him all about it when I'm there." She stood in my doorway for a moment longer, a ghost of the daughter I used to know. There was no grand apology, no tearful reunion. There was only the quiet acknowledgement of a shared memory, a love for a man we had both lost in different ways. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a repair. But it was perhaps the first tentative stitch in the long and difficult work of mending. And for now, with a trip to plan and a granddaughter to delight, it was enough. Florence welcomed us not with the grand, intimidating air of a city that knows its own importance, but with a soft, golden light that seemed to promise secrets and stories. Our hotel was a small, family-run place with a rickety elevator and a tiny balcony that overlooked a courtyard filled with terracotta pots of geraniums. It was imperfect, and it was wonderful. Sophie, my granddaughter, was enchanted by it. All the sounds of a new language, the narrow cobblestone streets, the sheer, overwhelming weight of history that seemed to hang in the very air. To see the world through her fresh, curious eyes was a gift I hadn't realized how much I had missed. Our second day, we went to the Uffizi gallery. It was the pilgrimage Arthur and I had always planned to make together. As I walked through those hallowed halls, I felt his presence beside me, a warm and familiar ghost. I found myself whispering to him in my mind, telling him what I was seeing just as we used to do in the small museums we explored together. But the true magic happened when I stopped talking to my husband's memory and started listening to his legacy. We stood before Botticelli's Primavera, a painting I had studied in books for 50 years. I was explaining the symbolism of the figures to Sophie when she interrupted me, her voice soft but certain. "But she doesn't look happy, Grandma," she said, pointing to the figure of Flora, the one scattering the flowers. "She's beautiful, but her eyes are sad." I looked closer, and for the first time I saw it too. I saw past the beauty and the myth and saw the human emotion that Arthur had always taught me to look for. In that moment, watching my granddaughter see the world with her grandfather's insightful heart, I felt a wave of love so profound it almost brought me to my knees. We spent the rest of our days not as tourists, but as explorers. We ate gelato on the steps of the Piazza della Signoria, getting delightfully lost in the labyrinth of streets on the other side of the Arno. We discovered a tiny family-run restaurant that served a pasta so simple and so perfect, it felt like a prayer. I watched Sophie try to speak a few words of Italian to the friendly old man who owned the place, her cheeks pink with effort and delight. These were the moments that mattered, the small UN photographable joys that would never appear in an auction catalog, but were more valuable than anything under that gavel. On our last evening, we sat on our small balcony, watching the swallows dip and soar in the twilight sky. Sophie was quiet for a long time, and then she turned to me. "This was the best trip of my life, Grandma." She said, her voice full of a sincere, uncomplicated gratitude. I reached out and took her hand. "My dear Sophie," I told her, "in you, I see the very best parts of your grandfather. His curiosity, his kind eyes, his ability to see the story behind the painting. This trip wasn't just for me to finally see Tuscany. It was for me to see him again, living on in you." That night, sitting on that small balcony in Florence with my granddaughter, I finally understood. My husband's true legacy wasn't in the dusty objects he had collected, but in the light in Sophie's eyes, in her curious and compassionate heart. My daughter and her husband had been chasing a legacy of wealth and status, something that could be bought and sold. But I had found the real inheritance. It was quiet. It was priceless. And in that small, sun-warmed city, I was finally passing it on to its rightful heir. Sophie and I returned from Tuscany with our bags full of small, inexpensive souvenirs and our hearts full of a new shared history. I felt a quiet, settled peace I hadn't known was possible. I had not just seen the world. I had seen my husband's legacy find its rightful home in the curious and kind heart of our granddaughter. My daughter Eleanor came to visit the day after I returned. She did not come with her husband, and she did not come with excuses. She came with a simple, homemade chicken soup, the kind I used to make for her when she was a child with a fever. She sat at my kitchen table, not with the air of a host or a manager, but as a guest in my home. She asked to see the pictures from my trip. As I showed her the photos of me and Sophie laughing in a sun-drenched piazza, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not jealousy, not anger. I think it was a quiet, dawning understanding. "Dad would have loved this," she said softly. "He would have loved seeing you both so happy." It was not an apology, but it was something far more important. It was the truth. I look at my life now, and I see how it has been rearranged. The story of my life didn't end at that auction. It truly began there. It's one of those classic grandma true stories, isn't it? The one about the quiet woman in the corner who finally decides to make some noise. But I've learned that the most powerful grandma true stories aren't about getting revenge. They're about reclaiming your own joy. It's a lesson I see told in so many different ways on Granny Stories. We are not just the supporting cast in the lives of our children. We have our own epic journeys to complete. My daughter, in her own misguided way, gave me an unexpected inheritance, the reason to remember my own strength. And that, I think, is the real heart of these grandma true stories. They are about finding value where you least expect it, not just in dusty antiques, but in your own resilient spirit. My story was never about what I could buy. It was about what I could finally become, the undisputed owner of my own life. Thank you for being here with me from the auction floor to the streets of Florence. If my story about finding one's own value has stirred something in you, I would be so honored if you would share your thoughts or a piece of your own story in the comments below. The tales we share are the most valuable collection of all. If you know someone who needs a reminder of their own worth, please feel free to share this story. And to join this wonderful gallery of shared wisdom, please consider subscribing to Granny Stories. Thank you for listening.